Vaya, Rosa. Ahora ya estamos iguales. Todos ciegos.
The thing that's amazing about the movie that you were about to see, just a quick backstory, in 2008, my wife Kathleen, who I'm happy to say, this is one of the rare occasions when she is here with me at the festival. Kathleen encouraged me to take a trip with her to Buenos Aires in Argentina back in 2008, and that turned out to be a magical turning point in my professional life, because I met a man there named Fernando Martin Pen, who was the guy who was actually responsible. You cinephiles in the audience know that 2008 was the year that they found the most complete version of Fritz Lang's Metropolis. And Fernando is the guy who did that. He is the one who found it. And I remember meeting him and talking about it and everything, and he tugged my sleeve as we were parting, and he said, "Eddie, this is only the tip of the iceberg." And since then, Fernando and I have become very good friends, but more importantly, colleagues in restoring many of these Argentine films from the Perón era that otherwise would have been lost.
We had a booming industry during the late 30s and early 40s. And it grew in an incredible way in a very, very short period of time. And there were actual studios built between 39 and 41, no less than 6 for different production companies, built in the mold of the American studios and run like the French. So it was a mixed influence that the Argentine industry had. And that also had to do with the kind of cinema that was successful in Argentina at that time. French films were very influential, as well as the American, of course, but French film had a huge audience. So that may explain the fact that we have proto-noirs made in the late 30s and the popularity of the genre afterwards. That industry grew mostly on the popularity of tango stars, the tango singers. It grew also on the popular figures of radio and theater. So when Christensen comes to the industry in 1940, he was very young, he was in his 20s. He comes from the radio. He also had studies in literature and philosophy. And that was extremely rare for a film director in Argentina at the time. He was an oddity. The first 2 or 3 films are not very good, are more or less the same that the rest of the industry was making. They were popular. And then he realized that he had to add a visual dimension to what he was doing. Literary sources were supported by visual ideas. Also, he defied censorship, in particular with the melodrama Sappho, which is one of the strongest and more daring melodramas made in the early 40s. And by the end of the 40s, after making comedies and more melodramas, he began to dwell into noir territory with La Muerte Camina en la Lluvia, an Argentine adaptation of The Murderer Inhabits Room 21 by Henri-Georges Clouzot, which is a very strange choice because the French film, hadn't been released in Buenos Aires. He knew about it, he made, the production company bought the rights to the film, and he did his own adaptation, and he added some humor to it. The film is quite dark, but it ends with a very light and unusual tone. The cops that have solved the crime, they just solved the mystery, they come out, and they go to the cinema to see La Muerte Camina en la Lluvia, the same film that they have taken part in. It's a very strange ending. Most of Christensen's career took place in a studio called Lumiton, but by the early 50s, the studio was not in a good shape. It was sold from the original owners to different people who didn't care about the quality of the production, so he left. And he proposed to Studio San Miguel to adapt stories by William Irish. This had to do with the popularity of noir literature. So he proposed to do an anthology film. San Miguel was a huge studio. You could do really whatever you liked there. He secured one of the best cinematographers at the time, that was Pablo Tabernero. Tabernero is a very important name in itself. He used the Pablo Tabernero name when he migrated to Argentina. He was German. His name was Peter Paul Weinschek, and he was chased off by the Nazis. First, he went with his family to Spain, and then he was chased by the Franquistas. So he ended up in Buenos Aires, like many other people at the time. Buenos Aires became a refugee for many people from Europe, and especially for Spanish people who supported the Republic. Christensen wanted these three stories in particular. So he shot them in close collaboration with Tabernero, and then the studio said that it would be impossible for the film to be released as a unity, because there was a cut that took longer than 2 hours. And that was completely unheard of in classical Argentine movies. There were discussions that delayed the release, and then sometime in those months, there was this arrangement that they were going to do 2 films instead of 1. What remained of the anthology was Don't Ever Open That Door, No Abras, Nunca, Puerta, with 2 of the stories. And he was to pad the second film, If I Die Before I Wake, in order to make it 70 minutes movie, something like that. And both films were released with a month difference. So the idea of unity was more or less kept, at least in the mind of the audience, because they both were very successful. They didn't save the production company. San Miguel was also in financial troubles. So you could say that both films are maybe the last important films that San Miguel produced.
Contesta, digo.
No lo esperaba de ti, Raúl. Me estás viendo desesperada.
René Dumas, the girl of the first episode, was a model and did some acting afterwards.
Pero no comprendes que es eso lo que estoy queriendo. Ayudarte.
Ángel Magaña was one of the most popular Argentine actors of the classical period. He did every kind of genre. He was very good at comedy, but he also is very good making drama. And he was active from the mid-30s, when he was very, very young, to the 70s, to the late 70s. He spent all his life in movies.
Disculpe, es una mala costumbre esta de silbar, pero no puedo remediarla.
Roberto Escalada started also late 30s, maybe. His career was also extremely successful, and he excelled in drama or melodrama. And this is probably the most important film for Hilde Pirovano.
¿Sí? ¿Quién es?
Una carta para usted.
You can spot her in many, many films, but this one is the most important role of her career.
Cierra la puerta con llave y no tengas miedo.
Regarding the other film, If I Die Before I Wake, the youngster was not from Argentina, he was from Venezuela. Christensen imported him from Venezuela. I don't know exactly why. His name was Néstor Sabarce. And the funny thing is that after making this film in Argentina, I think he did maybe 1 or 2 more films in Buenos Aires, but then he went back to Venezuela and he became a huge star there. He was a singer as well, and even a politician in the later years of his career, Néstor Sabarce. And from the 3 stories, I love the 3 of them, of course, but I think the first chapter of No Abras Nunca Puerta has always been somehow underrated. No? It's amazing because it's a mystery. And it's a mystery that is not explained in any way in the film. I always wonder how he dared to do it, because he left out to the audience to complete very important parts of the plot. What exactly is pressing her? We know that she gambles, but that is not enough to explain her despair.
Este asunto lo arreglaré yo, ¿lo oyes? Yo sola.
So the audience can imagine whatever in that situation, and that's very strong. No? That's in the story. William Irish wrote it that way, but in the film, it's very daring to make it that abstract. Christensen, from 52, 53, was trying to get away from Argentina, because the Argentine industry in the 50s was clearly collapsing. Mexico was a big competitor, and that competition began to erode the basis of Argentine industry in the 50s especially. He finally established himself in Brazil. And there is other reason. He was gay, although he was married and had a couple of kids. He lived a freer life in Brazil than in Argentina. Argentina society was much more restricted. He divorced in Brazil. He didn't sustain the facade of a marriage much longer. He continued his career, and his output is actually much more prolific in Brazil than in Argentina. At least 3 of them are masterpieces. Viaje a los senos de Duilia, El Niño y el Viento, which is one of the few gay-themed films made in Latin America, complete masterpieces. But he also compromised. He did films that allow him to keep going. He made a film about Pelé, the football player. He did in the early 80s another film in Argentina, which is either is the worst film you've ever seen in your life, or it's a masterpiece. It's a completely impossible film to qualify. But then he went back to Brazil and kept filming in Brazil, where he was much happier, I think. Christensen died in '99. He left an unfinished film, La Casa de Azúcar, that he was shooting as a co-production with Argentina. Too many years of cultural decadence, I suppose, prompted by successive dictatorships. They killed 30,000 people. So I think we never actually recover from that. And since then, we have a problem with memory. We don't want to remember. The archives, from any kind of archives or museums, are always underfinanced. Libraries they always have financial problems. We have a problem with keeping memory. In the 70s, when I was young, you were able to make a link with the cinema from the past because of television. Public television screened at least 2 Argentine films a day. Color TV appeared in the late 70s, early 80s, so those films which were in black and white, were put out of the market. It was almost impossible to see Argentine classical movies. So that bond that my generation had with classical film was not renewed. And we never had a national cinematheque. Nothing like a national cinematheque. There were some private collections, but that was all. And the National Film Institute has a collection of films, but they're just places when they put the cans together. I would never dare to say even that they store them. They are just there. The films are put in a place. The prints are put in a place. Nobody knows where most of the negatives are. Most of the original negatives from the 30s, 40s, and 50s were burned in a fire in '69. In that fire, we lost most of the nitrate negatives. It's a series of unfortunate mishaps. I work for film societies since the 80s, and we never forgotten these films. But film societies represent very small people. As time went on, the prints were decaying. San Miguel ceased to exist in the mid-50s. Turner, who ended up owning what was left of the prints, the negatives, and the company, donated whatever was left to the state, to the Argentine state. At that time, they called me up to the National Film Institute to check whatever materials were. They were very afraid of the nitrate, so we began by identifying what was nitrate, and we tried to put priorities, which films were decaying, which films were nitrate, which films had vinegar, and you came to the rescue with these 2 films because the original elements were very affected by vinegar. The sound of No Abras, Nunca esa puerta was gone. It had to be taken from a 60mm print that I had, and there are bits and pieces of the other film that were already missing. 1998, they began to appear extremely good Argentine films again, and I think it hasn't stopped. Still, Argentine cinema is very, very strong. But the recent filmmakers in Argentina, they don't know anything about, or they know very little about classical movies, and it's not their fault, actually. I think it's a debt the state must pay somehow. Sometime we had to have a national cinematheque. I hope when that happens, it won't be too late.